Sergei Akhromeyev. Sergei Akhromeyev was the last true marshal of the Soviet Union, a man who had survived every war, every purge, and every political storm the Soviet system had thrown at him for over 5 decades. He fought in the siege of Leningrad. He rose to become chief of the general staff. He was respected by both sides during the Cold War. Then, in August 1991, hardliners inside the Soviet government launched a coup attempt to stop the collapse of the USSR. It failed within 3 days. For Akhromeyev, that failure meant only one thing: everything he had spent his entire life building was gone forever. On August 24, 1991, he walked into his Kremlin office and hanged himself. He left a note that said, "I cannot watch the destruction of everything I gave my life to." He was 68 years old. The Soviet Union died. He refused to outlive it. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the man the world knew as the Red Napoleon, was killed by the very country he served. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was the most brilliant military mind the Soviet Union ever produced, the man who modernized the entire Red Army, developed airborne troops, and created the deep battle doctrine that would later win World War II. He was made Marshal of the Soviet Union in 1935. Then, in May 1937, Joseph Stalin, the iron-fisted leader of the Soviet Union, had him arrested on completely fabricated charges of treason. He was tortured until he confessed. His trial lasted exactly 1 day. On June 12, 1937, Mikhail Tukhachevsky was taken out and shot by firing squad. He was 44 years old. 4 years later, when Hitler invaded and the Soviet army was collapsing, Stalin desperately needed the exact military tactics he had just executed Tukhachevsky for developing. By then, it was far too late. Vasily Blucher, he was the very first marshal of the Soviet Union, and Stalin had him tortured to death in prison. Vasily Blucher had spent 20 years building the Soviet military presence in the Far East, winning battles and earning more decorations than almost any commander alive. Then, in 1938, he filed an honest report about a military failure at Lake Khasan. Stalin used it as an excuse. Blucher was arrested, thrown into an NKVD prison, and handed to Lavrenti Beria's men. They tortured him so severely he lost his eye during interrogation. On November 9, 1938, Vasily Blucher died in prison from his injuries. He was 48 years old. Stalin then ordered his body incinerated. The first marshal of the Soviet Union was not buried. He was burned and erased as if he had never existed. Alexander Yegorov, the man who signed his friend's death warrants to save himself, had no idea Stalin was already signing his. Alexander Yegorov was one of the original 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, a decorated hero of the Russian Civil War who had commanded armies and shaped the early Red Army. During the Great Purge, when Stalin began eliminating generals one by one, Yegorov did something desperate. He signed the death warrants of his own fellow officers, hoping Stalin would see him as loyal and spare him. Stalin took the signatures. Then he arrested Yegorov anyway. His wife was shot in August 1938. Yegorov himself was executed on February 23, 1939. He was 55 years old. The man who betrayed his colleagues to survive was killed regardless. In Stalin's Soviet Union, loyalty was never a shield. It was just another weapon Stalin used against you. Konstantin Rokossovsky, a person once labeled a failure, would soon become the one nobody could ignore. Konstantin Rokossovsky was one of the most gifted commanders in the Red Army when Stalin's Great Purge came for him in 1937. He was arrested, accused of being a foreign spy, and spent nearly 3 years being beaten and tortured in prison. His teeth were knocked out. 3 of his ribs were broken. He refused to confess to crimes he didn't commit. Then in 1940, Germany invaded, and Stalin suddenly needed every capable general he had left. Rokossovsky was released, handed back his uniform, and sent to the front. He went. He fought. He became one of the greatest commanders of the entire war. He died on August 3, 1968 in Moscow at age 71 from prostate cancer. The man Stalin tortured became the man Stalin needed most. Nikolai Vatutin. When a man survives Hitler's entire army, you expect him to be unstoppable. Nikolai Vatutin was one of the most brilliant Soviet battlefield commanders of World War II, the architect of Operation Uranus that encircled the Germans at Stalingrad, and the commander who held the line at the Battle of Kursk. On February 28, 1944, while his car was traveling through Ukraine, it was ambushed by Ukrainian insurgent army guerrillas. Vatutin was shot in the leg. The wound became infected. His leg was amputated on April 5, 1944. It didn't save him. Nikolai Vatutin died on April 15, 1944, from blood poisoning. He was just 42 years old. The man who had outmaneuvered some of history's greatest German commanders was killed not in battle, but on a routine drive through the countryside. Pavel Rykogov, he said 4 words to Stalin's face that got him and his wife killed. At just 29 years old, Pavel Rykogov was the head of the entire Soviet Air Force. In a meeting with Joseph Stalin, he was asked directly why Soviet pilots kept dying during peacetime training. Rykogov stood up, looked Stalin dead in the eye, and said, "Because you make us fly in coffins." The room froze. Nobody spoke to Stalin like that. Ever. Stalin said nothing and walked out. 2 months later, Rykogov was arrested. Beria's men tortured him for months, beating confessions out of him that he never willingly gave. No proper trial. No jury. On October 28, 1941, Pavel Rykogov was taken out and shot. His wife, Soviet Air Force Major Maria Nestorenko, was dragged out and shot the same day beside him. He told Stalin the truth once. Stalin made sure there would never be a second time. Lavrenti Beria, for 20 years, the man made millions beg for their lives. When his moment came, he got on his knees and begged too. Lavrenti Beria was the most feared man in the Soviet Union after Stalin himself, the chief of the NKVD, who personally oversaw the torture and execution of hundreds of thousands of people during the Great Purge. When Stalin died in March 1953, Beria made his move to seize power. His rivals moved faster. On June 26, 1953, he was arrested by Soviet military officers. At his trial, he fell to the floor and begged on his knees for mercy. It was not a quality he had ever shown to others. It was not shown to him. On December 23, 1953, Lavrenti Beria was shot. The man who had sent countless others to their deaths died exactly the same way. Semyon Budyonny during the Great Terror of the 1930s. Stalin's secret police were arresting and executing generals across the Soviet Union. When NKVD agents showed up at Semyon Budyonny's home to take him in, he did something nobody else dared to do. He grabbed his Nagant pistol, aimed it at the agents, and picked up the phone to call Stalin personally. He demanded the agents be sent away immediately. Stalin, perhaps amused, perhaps calculating, complied. The agents left. Budyonny survived the purge entirely. He lived through the entire war, outlasted Stalin himself, and died on October 26, 1973, at age 90, from a brain hemorrhage in Moscow. In a system where thousands of generals were killed, one man survived simply by refusing to be taken. Ivan Konev, a commander who beat Zhukov to Berlin, thought he had changed history. Ivan Konev was one of the most decorated Soviet commanders of World War II, the general whose forces liberated Auschwitz, captured Vienna, and reached Berlin before anyone else. Stalin deliberately set him and Zhukov in competition against each other, knowing rivalry would drive both men harder. After the war, Konev remained a powerful military figure, but was repeatedly sidelined whenever his influence grew too large. He died on May 21, 1973, at age 75 in Moscow from cancer. He was buried in the Kremlin Wall necropolis, his remains resting just meters from Stalin, the man who had spent decades using him and fearing him in equal measure. Nikolai Yezhov, a war leader responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, never saw it as a crime. Nikolai Yezhov ran the NKVD at the height of Stalin's Great Purge, signing execution orders, overseeing torture, and sending hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens to their deaths between 1936 and 1938. The period was so brutal, it became known as the Yezhovshchina, the Yezhov era. Then, Stalin decided he was a liability. Yezhov was arrested in 1939, tortured, and shot on February 4th, 1940. He was 44 years old. But Stalin went further. Yezhov's face was literally airbrushed out of official Soviet photographs. In one famous image taken beside the Moscow-Volga Canal, Yezhov simply vanished, replaced by empty space. The man who erased others was erased himself. Completely, officially, as if he had never existed at all. Andrei Vlasov, he was one of Stalin's most celebrated generals. Then, he switched sides and fought for Hitler. That decision ended one way. Andrei Vlasov was the Soviet general who helped save Moscow in 1941, celebrated across the country as a hero of the Soviet Union. In 1942, his army was encircled, and he was captured by the Germans. What happened next shocked the entire Soviet Union. Vlasov agreed to switch sides. He became the leader of the Russian Liberation Army, a force of Soviet prisoners who fought under the Nazi flag against Stalin. When Germany collapsed in 1945, Vlasov tried to surrender to the Americans. They turned him away. Soviet forces captured him instead. On August 1st, 1946, Andrei Vlasov was hanged in Moscow. He was 44 years old. The man who once saved his country was executed by it as the most hated traitor in Soviet history. Dmitry Pavlov Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military invasion in human history. Dmitry Pavlov commanded the Western Front when Hitler's forces tore through his lines in the very first hours. Within days, his entire army group had collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, captured, or surrounded. Stalin needed someone to blame, and Pavlov was standing right there. He was arrested, stripped of his rank, accused of cowardice and mismanagement, and given a trial that was over almost before it began. On July 22, 1941, exactly 1 month after the invasion, Dmitry Pavlov was shot by firing squad. He was 44 years old. His property was confiscated. His decorations were taken. And he was buried in a landfill near Moscow. Not a grave. A landfill. The man who lost the battle was punished, as if he had started it. Mikhail Frunze, one of the most powerful men enough to stop Stalin from taking complete control of the Soviet Union. Everyone knew it, including Stalin. Mikhail Frunze was the most respected military commander in the country, a brilliant strategist, a hero of the Civil War, and widely considered the most likely successor to Lenin. In October 1925, doctors told him he needed surgery for a stomach ulcer. Frunze reportedly didn't want the operation. Stalin personally insisted he go through with it. On October 31, 1925, Mikhail Frunze died on the operating table from chloroform poisoning. He was 40 years old. The official explanation was a routine surgical complication. But historians have argued for nearly a century that Stalin arranged the entire thing, that the operation was never meant to heal him. Stalin delivered the eulogy at his funeral, then took his job.